Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about Goffman, the idea of dramaturgical analysis, and then we're going to start talking about stigma in our article on spoiled identities. So that's the direction that we're going at. So Goffman is the last of our big symbolic interactionists. We're going to talk about, and Goffman's whole theory is sometimes referred to as dramaturgical analysis. And privacy simply means like that it kind of uses theater as this sort of like extended metaphor for how people interact with one another. So, you know, we have roles that we play, and by roles he basically means anything that you can identify yourself as is probably a role, right? So like, you play the role of being a daughter or son, or a brother or sister, or, you know, an employee, or a student, or a et cetera, et cetera. These are all roles that you actively play. And to play these roles, we use all kinds of techniques. So part of that is like we speak and try to talk the way that our role, right? And we often will practice these in our heads, and you sort of like playing lines. Right? We have props, things that we regularly use, right? We have costumes, all of which help us play the different roles that we've been given. So I think if we think about more heightened situations, it makes a lot of sense for Goffman. So if we think about like what do we do before we go on a date or a job interview, which are surprisingly similar if you really think about it, right? Like what sort of things do you do to prepare?
Do you like rehearse? Like, I like for an interview, I know you look up questions they might ask you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You literally rehearse. You learn your lines, right? Like you think about, okay, if they ask like why they should hire me, like this is going to be my answer, right? Which is actually surprisingly similar to if you go on a date. Has anybody ever done that for dating? Like I used to do that. I would be like, oh, I'm going to tell them this if they bring this up, and like when they ask me, like I'm going to try to say that because it's going to sound so cool. It's going to make me sound so cool. I was really bad at dating, by the way, but I used to rehearse lines a lot. Maybe I over-rehearsed. But anyways, so like, yeah, you do that. What do you do? What else do you do in preparation of a job interview or a date?
You might clean up yourself, make yourself look presentable, look nice.
Yeah. You put on a certain set of clothes. You do your hair, like you do it all upright. You want to impress people, right? Not the same set of clothes, right? For both, per se. Like, depending on what you do as a date, right? But you're gonna actually try to that's like putting on a costume, right? We do these things for everything, right? That's just a heightened version of it. But we do this for Goffman, we do this in an everyday sense. So we're constantly, in one way or another, performing the roles that we have, right? Roles we want to have, as well as roles that we're just assigned, right? Like you don't necessarily pick whether you're going to be, a sibling, right? Or who you're going to be a sibling to, but it's a role you have to play. You can play it well, you can play it poorly, but you have to play it, right? So that's kind of Goffman. So Goffman, it's important for Goffman because do you act the same in one setting from another? So, like, when you're a student, you don't act the same as like when you go back with your dorm and hang out with your friends, right? Which one's you? Right, because if you're not the same person from one setting to another, which one are you?
dorm?
Was that?
When you go back to your dorm?
Yeah, like when you go back to the dorm versus when you're here versus when you're home. Do you act the same around your friends as you do around your parents? Not really, no. At least I didn't. I'm a very different person between my friends and my parents growing up, right? Not to say that you're at that stage of life, right? But even if you think back to like your high school years, right? So, which one? Back to the question: which one is you?
All of it. I think like all of, like you like learn how to act in different settings based off of like the environment and like society and
Yeah.
how we should act.
And that's exactly what Goffman is trying to bring us to. All of them are you. So in other words, he has a decentered theory of self. In the end, for Goffman, we're all just kind of con men trying to convince each other that we actually belong in the roles that we have, or don't belong, depending on what the role is. Right? So there isn't really this sort of like honest me out there. For Goffman, the honest you is just the maker of roles, which no one else gets to see. Right? And you internalize your roles often to such a degree for Goffman that even when you're by yourself, often most of the time you're still performing. Right? So like, there really isn't a you behind all those roles. You're just like this amalgamation of different roles that you play. Make sense? Cool. Let's skip over to the article. This is a very connected article. This definitely grows out of Goffman's theory. This is part of a larger literature called, sometimes referred to as the literature on stigma. Sometimes also called preservation of self. And this literature kind of is interested in a sub-question to the kind of questions we've been asking in social psychology this week so far, which is, how's it different if you really don't want the role you have? Does anybody ever have to play a role that they were uncomfortable with as a person? I'm thinking like, does anybody ever had a job they really disliked? What's it like what do you act like when you have a job that you dislike? What sort of things do you do?
Well, I was a waitress, and I like being a waitress. I just like the place that I worked for. And it was, I don't know, it's kind of weird. I always have to like, if the customers like making me mad or like being really rude, I just have to like be happy anyway. Because like they're like income.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, you're speaking to a very different phenomenon than this one, which is often referred to as emotion work. This is something else that symbolic interactions are really interested in. It's this idea that like in a lot of industries, we have to like play out a specific emotion, which actually affects like, have anyone ever performed an emotion and then started to feel it? This is really common. Like, has anyone ever gone to a funeral and not felt sad? But you pretend to be sad because it's a funeral. You can't just be like, oh, I have good news today. How y'all doing? Hey, no, you can't do that, right? So you pretend to be sad. And then you start to feel sad, right? So in certain positions, like if you're working as a waitress or a stewardess on a plane or something like that, like you have to do this kind of emotion work. It's also very genderized because women have a tendency to have to perform emotion work. Men have a tendency not to. Okay, anyone else have a job that they dislike?
I didn't like it because of the management and with my boss and my boss, and so when she came around, I always asked like I was busy, so that way she gave class to me.
Yeah.
Or like I'll be like, I'm with my friend. And she wouldn't allow us to have breaks, so like when we go to the bathroom, so I'll just stand there for 5 minutes. Not like I'm always cute. Like she's just me out all the time. She yells at us all the time, and she didn't tell us. And she's like, how do you even know this? I'm like, well, you didn't tell us, so why didn't you know this stuff? Half the time I just hated being there, and she like put the blame on us when it's actually my fault.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of drama too with like coworkers. She was a bad environment.
Yeah.
And then I got like food poisoning one night, and then I had to go home, and then she didn't believe me, and she was like, I don't believe you. And I was like, I'm about to throw up. So like, if you want me to work, with all these customers are out here with me, almost right now. I'll be glad to. Then I finally quit. But
See,
everybody's quit at the same time too. Lots of telling people.
yeah, you have a great number of examples in there of exactly kind of what. So you're of a phenomenon called role distancing. Because we're going to see a specific form of that later, right? You avoid people, you sometimes act in grouchy ways, right, et cetera, et cetera. Like I used to be a sandwich artist at Subway. So like, it's a pretty bad job. Like I used to go, and I was a shift runner, so I was kind of in charge, but I hated the job anyways. But I do things like, if nobody was paying attention, I'd go disappear and sit in the freezer and eat the raw cookie dough. You know? And anyone else have a bad experience at jobs and how they behaved when they were in them? Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I worked at a daycare, and I loved my kids, but manager, dang, she's crazy. She would like, every time we were low on daycare workers, she would hire new daycare workers, and then she had too many, and then she'd cut all of our hours, so none of us got like as many hours as we wanted.
Yeah.
But I was never, like, I never complained about it for a bit, like I was always like, oh, it's okay, it's fine, you're good. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so here we get an interesting combination. So like here we've been talking about role distancing, and you're talking about something else, which would be called role embrace. Right? You like the kids, so you to some degree embrace your role. Right? You performed like essentially being, you know, accommodating, etc., because you wanted to hold on to that role of the person who takes care of the kids. Which is sometimes very different from a job that you find demeaning, right? If you find what you're doing demeaning, you're likely to perform it very differently. This is why, has anybody ever noticed that disproportionately people who work at fast food restaurants are kind of rude? Why is that? Well, it's because it's a crappy enough and demeaning enough job that a lot of people are there who don't really want that job, right? Or they want the job because they need the money. But they actually feel embarrassed by being there, so they distance themselves from that role. They want to communicate to you, I'm not really a fast food worker for the rest of my life, I'm just here because this is my teenage job. Right? Does that make sense? If you think about role distancing behaviors, I often think about teenagers who are embarrassed of their parents. What sort of things do teenagers that are embarrassed of their parents do? Body language, things like that. Like what sort of things do they do? We've all seen this, right? How would you describe it?
Like what is the parent does?
No. What do the kids act like when they're embarrassed of their parents in public?
Yeah, they act like they don't know them.
They might act like they don't know them. What else might they do?
Kind of hide their face and kind of like, I don't know this person is.
Yeah, not look at them, right? Like you see that all the time. The kids will just, or they'll like.
Oh, my phone is just
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what the phone was called. There was a thing. I'm trying to remember. This was a thing in the media that like most of the, like 30% of the time when people are looking at their phones in public, they don't actually have them on.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah, it's just like I don't want to be like awkward and like kind of like.
Yes, so they just like hide behind it. And you see, I think teenagers do this a lot when they're in embarrassing situations. Because actually being a teenager often involves, and youth is actually our last one in the article, right? Often involves a lot of embarrassment or distancing from one's role. So yeah, so they'll do that, or like the like I'm frustrated with you sigh that teenagers like really master with their parents. Like I'm thinking like 13, 14-year-olds in particular, right? Like they'll sit there like,
Roll their eyes.
yeah, roll their eyes, right? Like all these things are called role distancing, because essentially if you're standing there, they're distancing themselves from their parents. They're distancing themselves from the role of playing their son or daughter, right? And they want you, the outside observer, to know, I don't think these people are cool. I'm not happy to be here, right? Which is something like, it's funny because it's something we actually do often very automatically. We don't choose to do it. We all automatically kind of do these role distancing behaviors. How does this fit in? When we have roles we don't like, we don't want them to reflect on us. So we often try to find ways of negating the fact that we have them to preserve a positive concept of self. Nobody wants to think bad things about themselves. Right? And as human beings, we have remarkable ability to actually distance ourselves from our roles, right? At least to ourselves, if not to anybody else. And so that's kind of the idea of the literature. The idea of the literature is kind of pulling out and teasing out all those detailed, minutiae ways that people talk about themselves and think about themselves in light of having these negative roles. Okay, so getting back to the actual text before us. Where's it taking place? Where are these people from that are being interviewed? What's that?
Are you talking about the youth one?
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't say we're doing Hula Chans exploring the spoiled and celebrated identities of young and homeless drug users. So what were you saying?
Scotland is where they're from.
Yeah, so I think it's England actually. They're because they mock people with Scottish accents. I think that's what it is. I think it's in England. If not, I said it wrong in my first intro class. Because when they make fun of heroin addicts, they make fun of Scottish people, so that leads me to think that they're not Scottish. I don't know. Either way, it's on that island someplace. Okay, so what specific setting are we in for them? So it's in Scotland. Where do these people live? Nobody caught this?
Are you talking about authors?
What's that?
Are you talking about authors?
No, the young people that they're studying, where are they living? Are they in a homeless shelter? It's a hostel. What is a hostel? Has anyone ever seen a youth hostel, been in a youth hostel, stayed in a youth hostel?
Isn't there like a really cheap, like, small hotel room like Europe?
Yeah, it's usually not. You usually don't have your own room.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, don't you share with other people so it's like cheaper?
Yeah, it's kind of like paying a little bit of money to sleep in an army barracks. That's what it kind of feels like. So it's often it's large communal spaces, right? So like you may have even up to, depending on where you're doing this, like you may even have up to 20 or 30 people in your room. They're big rooms if that's the case, right? But essentially it's a very cheap way to travel. So it's usually not very comfortable, it's not as clean as a regular hotel, right? But it's cheap and it's mostly young people who do it. So these people are permanently living in this hostel, right? So these are the people that they're interviewing. Okay, so let's get into the distinctions. How do they talk about, and this starts, if you're following along in the text, on page 77, we start getting introduced to their different identities. So how do they talk about being homeless? What are the ways that they avoid the stigma of being homeless? Because these are people who obviously have left their homes and are living in the hostel. about being homeless. Yeah, go ahead.
So we talk about like they're less homeless than real homeless people.
Yeah, there's the high and low homelessness. So if somebody is, so they make a distinction that they're not high homeless, they're low homeless, meaning they're not like really homeless, they're just kind of homeless. Is this a distinction most of us have about homelessness? Do we make a distinction between kind of homeless and really homeless usually, linguistically? No, for most of us, homeless is homeless, right? This is a strategy referred to as categorical distancing. And you get this, has anybody ever interacted with homeless people very much at all? I knew a lot of the homeless, you did, what situation were you in that you?
I live in Colorado, so it's really cold, and so during like the winter months, they have like this thing where in the church basement, like they let a certain amount of people come in, and it was really cool because we got to like interact with them, and we looked at their stuff, because they get really scared, because like obviously what they're carrying on their back is all that they own, and so I was in charge of putting all of their stuff in like a plastic bag and tying it up and putting it in the closet. But it was just interesting because like, it's kind of like they have their own community within, like, no community, if that makes sense. Like, you just have like a general understanding among each other, like, that they're connected in some way.
Yeah, and we'll get into the community thing with homeless people, because I think that actually has a connection to something, the next thing we're going to talk about as well. You'll actually hear like homeless people use a lot of these sort of strategies if you ever interact with them. If you actually are interested in interacting with homeless people and helping them out a little, there's actually a pretty good program through here called Uplift. I was doing it, you can't do it right now because it's down in Kansas City and they don't want people going back and forth. But in the future, let's keep it in mind. Anyways, I didn't assign something on homelessness to give a plug. I'm just doing it since but when I was in Richmond, Virginia, I knew a lot of the homeless people in my neighborhood, and they'd often talk about, and it's interesting because like people who sleep in shelters would make this distinction. They'd be like, well, I'm not like the homeless people who sleep out of doors, right? But the people who sleep out of doors would make almost the same exact categorical distinction as not being as desperate as the people who sleep in shelters, or as dangerous as the people who sleep in shelters, that they're like, or they'll say things like, I'm not really homeless because I have a tent down by the river, right? Which is not a distinction we would make, right? But it allows them to distance themselves from a certain image, because what is our image of homelessness? What pops into our head?
Not being able to go anywhere alone, step outside, not being able to have anywhere else to go. Like,
For me, it's drug users, they're a bunch of drug addicts, or
It's usually a stereotype. What other stereotypes do we have about homeless people? Sleeping bad on concrete.
You might have some sort of like mental disorder, maybe you can't deal with it.
Mentally ill.
I mean, I don't personally think it was kind of a lot of people say like they're lazy or like they like got themselves in that situation, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so the article kind of in some ways starts with this idea that like the idea of homelessness was started to answer a problem, like that people had such persistent poverty they were sleeping on the streets. But the title actually itself became this kind of stigmatized thing. So why is it that people are doing that? Like essentially they're saying like, I'm not the dirty person with needles in their arms sleeping on the street. I'm something else. And so like, but almost all homeless people make that same distinction, right? Because nobody is that sort of demon that we constructed around homelessness, right? So people make that distinction. So it's categorical. Another example from a different piece. So I signed an article a couple of years ago where they were doing, I might have brought up this article because it was a really well-written article, but they were doing interviews of people drinking in bars in the morning. The guy did this for like, I think it was like 6 years. So every day before work, he would go, he was a college professor, researcher, go to a bar in the morning and like hang out with people, he'd drink coffee there, and then like get to know people and interview them. But people often made this distinction of like, I'm an alcoholic, but I'm not an alcoholic like the people at the bar down the road. Those morning drinkers, those people are alcoholics. I'll have 4 or 5 and then I'll go to work. Right? But those people down the road, they had it hard. They're passed out by 10. They don't have jobs. Like, I'm functional. Right? And that's exactly the same sort of thing. Like, being an alcoholic is a stigmatized thing. So you have to draw categorical distinctions to avoid the label. Right? And that's exactly what people are doing. And that's a way of role distancing. We call this categorical distancing. So, okay, so what's the other way that they fight back against their homeless label? Can I catch another one? This kind of deals with the sense of community thing that you were bringing up before.
Didn't they say in the article, like, since they all work together in this hostel, that it's like they have a home in the community as opposed to the junkies who don't have any friends, apparently.
Yeah, that's the exact, so it's another distinction that they make, but essentially like you can recategorize, right, the hostel as a home because of the community that you live in. And actually, like, this is also another way that our stereotypes about homeless people don't really hold to what they are. Like, often they actually do have very, like, intricate communities with each other. And they actually watch out for each other. It's a big part of what they do, but they all know each other. And they help each other out. And, like, it's actually, like, a very, in some ways, like, homeless people have tighter knit communities than most of us do. Because they have to. But that also becomes this sort of justification that, like, they aren't homeless in the sense that we think of it, right? Okay, let's talk about, I think there's another distinction to be made. So, did I catch, I'm going to back up for a little bit, and we're going to go to page, we're going to go to page 77. They may catch this distinction between discredited and discreditable identities. Discreditable versus discredited identities. This, and when we're talking about spoiled identities, this often has something to do with role, embrace, and distance.
They were negative characteristics that like you can see.
Yeah, so discredited is that it's obvious, you can't hide it. So when Goffman wrote Stigma, he was particularly doing a study of people who are physically or mentally disabled. So discreditable is the opposite of that, right? So it's things that are more invisible. Or at least you can hide them. Or, and this is the language literature generally uses, they can pass, right? Which was the language that the people he was studying were using. They were talking about passing, pretending not to be disabled. So we just think about it in that context. What form of mental or physical disability can you not hide? If we were talking about that as a spoiled identity. Because we often discredit people on the basis of disability.
Any disability?
Yeah.
You have a speech impediment?
But you can't hide a speech impediment, right? And often, like, has anybody here ever known anybody with a stutter? Right? And often, like, people who have really strong stutters, Like they feel like often people treat them like they're stupid, even though they're not, right? Like they can think just as well as everyone else, they just have a stutter. You know, but like it's very hard for somebody with a stutter to act like they don't have one, right? It might be a disability that is easy now, or at least easier.
Okay, so this can get a little personal, but I only have one eye. And so people always come up to me like, oh, I have to always forget that because I have a prosthetic eye, and so people can't tell it, and so it's easier for me to hide it, even though, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of obvious though to me, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great example, right? Like, you know, sometimes I had a friend in college with a missing leg who often just didn't acknowledge, like, he would often hide it. He wore pants during the summer and stuff like that, so you couldn't see it because he was felt embarrassed about it, right? But it allowed him to sort of pass, right? So like in the same way, like you get this with homeless people, right? So some homeless people are capable of pretending that they're not homeless, others are not, right? But the significance of this for our conversation now is often discreditable characteristics will involve role distancing. As in, like, people are more likely to hide it, but where discredited identities, since they often can't be hidden, often involve actual role embrace. Thinking about these teenagers, it's probably pretty easy for them to pretend like they're not homeless when they're, you know, and so we get this very like clear sort of role distancing behavior. And it also is how comfortable you are in your identity, right? So like you may just be perfectly comfortable with something that to some populations would be a spoiled identity, and then not for every population are the same things discredited, right? So not all of them are stigmatized equally. I think that actually links us really well into the next one. So the next one is their discussion of drug use. So how does the drug use differ from the homelessness for the participants? What kind of drug are they using? I'm going to put it back, start with that. Anybody catch this? Yeah, they're mostly smoking pot, right? Like that's kind of what they're doing, right? How do they talk? Like, how do we see some like distancing in terms of behavior about drug use, though? What's the comparison here that's made?
So they talk about how like, they're using marijuana, but it's way less addictive than heroin, is what the street nurses do. So it's, you know, like the less addictive, more acceptable.
Which I mean is also like that's true, right? Like marijuana is not as hard for you as heroin. It's not as hard on your body, right? Like what else is like the more the distinction that they're making is they often make fun of drug users, right? This is where the Scottish thing comes in. They make fun of, they do a Scottish accent with each other and talk about getting methadone, which is the thing you use to get off heroin, or they make comments about heroin addicts, or they make comments about junkies a lot. So this is like a population, right, that essentially like, and this is the thing about that categorical distancing is basically like it often is kind of skipping the hatred off onto somebody else who's even more vulnerable than you are, which is often what people will do in situations of stigmatization. But to some degree, they're actually pretty embracive of their marijuana use. Which I think like we could kind of back up and question whether this is the researcher calling this a stigma. Because like people think in some communities where marijuana use might not be a stigma. I might just feel this way because I'm from Michigan. Does anybody know what happened in Michigan 2 years ago? It's completely legalized, yeah. You can just buy it anywhere. There's just like places that sell. In fact, it even got listed as an essential industry by the Michigan government. So like they stayed open during shelter at home. Anyways, so like where I'm from, like the last time I lived in Michigan, the town I was living in, which was Chesaning, a small town, decided it was going to get a lot of tourism money by allowing people to smoke it in public anywhere in the township. So like, you'd just be like walking down the street and people would just be like, walking down the street smoking a joint. Like it was nothing. And it was kind of weird at first, but like, nonetheless, like thinking about like, if you were in Michigan today, right, maybe not today, but maybe before everybody was supposed to stay home, like, I'm not sure you could call using marijuana a stigma at that point, right? Like, it's just something that people do. I'm not promoting marijuana use, so don't take that the wrong way. We're just literally analyzing whether, and I do wonder, like in England, if this is stigmatized as the author kind of presents it here.
Would in Michigan, be kind of, I guess, reversed? Like if you don't use marijuana or smoke it, you would be the...
Not really. I'd say probably like only maybe less than half of the population does anyways, even though it's legal. I actually don't think you saw a big increase in the amount of people using it, because like, also like anybody who has a job where they test for like can't do it still and stuff like that. But no, I'm not a marijuana smoker. Other than some bad experiences when I was like 17. By the way, I get blunt about things. I also want to share, like I will sometimes talk about my own past pretty bluntly. There's also like, I'm an adult convert to Christianity as well, so sometimes I may even make references to sexual things from my younger years or something like that, if it's contextually, like, don't take that the wrong way. It's not a promotion, it's just an identification of like, I don't know. So, I'm not promoting drug use in any way, shape, or form. That's my caveat for the day. Okay, so yeah, distancing. Okay, yeah, so this is also like part of that image of homelessness I think they're intertwined. Okay, what's the youth identity thing? How do we think of youth as a spoiled or stigmatized identity? In what ways do we present youth as something bad? An awkward question for a middle-aged man to ask young people.
What was that question again?
How culturally do we present youth as something bad? How is it a stigmatized thing?
Like how we constantly tell kids to like grow up.
Can you say that?
Like how we tell kids like grow up.
Yeah, grow up. So we, in that case, what are we coding youth as? It's something
Like bad or wrong.
something childish, like even the word childish, right? Is self-disparaging towards youth. What other ways do we treat youth as something stigmatized? What do we assume about young people often, especially older people?
They're selfish and ignorant.
Yeah. So as a general rule, older people have a tendency to think that young people are selfish and ignorant. I mean, if you don't think that's true, just like read things written about young people in the newspapers, especially anything revolving around technology, and you're definitely going to see like youth portrayed as something stigmatized, right? There's actually a lot of like antagonism towards young people these days. So like, how is it that young people escape the identity of their youth, of being young? In what ways do we embrace it culturally? Because that's the other, let's go that way, route. In what ways do we embrace youth culturally? In what ways is youth thought of as something positive?
For like, stay young, you don't have to pay bills and like grow up.
We often venerate youth as a period without responsibility. Is this actually true?
No.
Not really. Like, you couldn't pay me to be a teenager in high school, right? Like, in a lot of ways, it's a really stressful time. There's a lot of important identity work that goes on, right? this is kind of devalued culturally, so it's presented, which actually like they're tied together. What else is, what other ways do we think of youth as something positive? I mean, we have a lot of idealization of youth. I mean, like you think about like television shows and movies, like what percent of them involve characters, primary characters that are under the age of 20, right? Like a lot of them. Turn on Netflix.
They can lean on other people when they're younger, depend upon other people.
Yeah, that's kind of the responsibility. It's also thought of as freedom, right? Like when you're young, you get to do whatever you want, right? You also don't have a set path. Anything you want, these are all kind of lies, right? But anything you want to be, you can be, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's the way we sort of reify youth as something positive. How do we see this contradiction in the article surrounding how they talk about youth? How do we see a contradiction?
I guess because you give them that freedom to do whatever they want, and then they go and do something, almost in a sense that enslaves them or leads them down a dark path, so they choose to do something bad with the freedom that they've been given.
I'm looking specifically for like that section where they talk about youth as a spoiled identity. So the researcher is, like most people who teach at universities, middle-aged, right? So how do they tease him? How do the teenagers tease him as participants? They point out that they can have more fun than him, right? Like they do, there's a couple times that he brings this up. Then he brings up the tension on the other end, because like the young people who live in the hostel, they're not all the same age. There's a major year demarcation for people in England. We spread ours out a bit more. So what can they do when they're 18? Oh, did you?
Drink.
Yeah, they can drink publicly. They can go to the bar, right? So there ends up being this weird tension, right? So like on one end it's presented as something like positive youth, and the other end it's treated as something that has to be overcome. And it becomes this major distancing thing within their community, right? So like, so there's that tension. That's the last of the three. Any questions about spoiled identities and stigma? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking, when I was reading the article, I feel like my idea of what spoiled identity meant didn't really line up with what they were talking about. So
Yeah.
it seemed to me something more like selective, or I don't know. Can you explain, like, in a sociological sense, what spoiled identity means?
Yeah. So spoiled identity in this case, in the case that it's being used here, it's the same as what I was saying for stigma. So a spoiled identity is just a role, right, that is stigmatized by the culture around us, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that like, even like, no matter what, going back to people are preserving the concept of self, so they're going to have a positive understanding of who they are, right? But within that, there's this tension caused by having an identity that people see as spoiled. Other questions or thoughts before we close up? We got 1 minute left, so if somebody has something itching they want to say. Okay. Have a great day. See you guys Friday. We'll talk about our narrative culture of drinking article and get into the carnivalesque and dialogical communication.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Forget it.
Can we go ahead and start reading Can we go ahead and start reading one for next week?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
At any point you want to do it. They're up for the whole semester. So if you want to read ahead, you can.
Okay. I'm ready to do that for me. I was doing Sundays. It's a weird day. I don't know, I'm used to seeing it done like on Mondays, like in high school.
Oh yeah. I'm just making sure that they're done before we meet,
Which I get, that makes sense. like college is different, so I can't like it. None of it makes sense.
Have a good day.
You too.